Let me introduce myself. I'm Margot Young, a professor of law at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. And beside me is Joel Backen, also a professor of law at the Allard School of Law at UBC. And we'll be emceeing tonight's discussions and presentations. This event is part of a series of discussions that have been rolling across Canada today. So these discussions began in Halifax, early BC time, and we're the last in a series of 4 or 5 of them that have gone across the country. The WAVE event has been sponsored by the Royal Society of Canada, and this particular Vancouver event by the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the UBC. I want to begin by acknowledging the land on which this event takes place. We sit on the historic, traditional, and unceded lands of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And indeed, as we engage with these events, these issues so critical to Canada's Constitution, to the marker of Canada's 150th anniversary of its Confederation, acknowledgement of the land on which we sit, of the issues that are represented by our presence on this land are an important part of any conversation to be had about the Constitution. And we will be engaging with issues of Indigenous justice and of reconciliation tonight. Joel and I thought, as constitutional professors, we would take a few minutes to tell you a bit about the Constitution, or at least a piece of the backdrop that exists for this event, to set the stage, as it were. So, as I'm sure you know, this year marks the 150th anniversary of the Confederation of Canada, an act accomplished by the British Parliament and enshrined in Canadian law as one of our most important constitutional moments and creating one of our most central constitutional texts. 35 years ago, another act of the British Parliament enshrined significant amendments to the earlier Constitution, and these amendments include both Section 35, which provides for Aboriginal rights, and also the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Well, this afternoon we engage critically with these documents. We look at them through the lenses of environmental justice, justice for Indigenous peoples, and social justice more broadly. Each of our speakers brings perspectives to this conversation that show the challenges and the opportunities for our country as we face the next 150 years and a continuing engagement with our constitutional dialogue. Constitutions do many things. Most evocatively, as one constitutional scholar has put it, they capture the core values and aspirations for a country, what we think we are at our best, what we want to preserve and what we want to foster going forward. In this way, in the same scholar's words, the Constitution has been described as a mirror of the national soul. Now, our Constitution has some very pragmatic and practical provisions in it, but it also has very evocative and aspirational moments in its text.
Thanks, Margot. I think it's important to remember, just following up on what Margot was talking about, that 150 years is really just a blink of an eye when compared to the thousands, the tens of thousands of years that this territory and all the territories that comprise Canada were occupied by organized societies, by nations. And what that means inevitably, intrinsically, is that the Constitution Act of 1867 effectively imposed an alien nation upon existing nations. It was a colonial act. There were no First Nations leaders among the Fathers of Confederation, as Margot was speaking of the picture of those Fathers of Confederations. None were invited to that table. What the Fathers of Confederation did was to divide power over First Nations, not to divide power with them.
So it's my pleasure now to introduce this afternoon's speakers. I'm going to introduce them more fully at the beginning all together, and then they'll come up in turn and speak. And at the end of that sequence, we're going to have them all come up to the stage and engage in a bit of a discussion, hopefully fueled by the Twitter comments that I don't see you doing at the moment, but I know that as soon as you get something up here, one of the speakers you'll be sending, and we'll have someone moderating them to put them up for us. So I want to begin by introducing my colleague, Jocelyn Stacey. Jocelyn is a professor of law at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Jocelyn will be speaking first, and there's much I could say about Jocelyn, as with all of these speakers, but I'm going to mention simply that Jocelyn has a forthcoming book titled The Constitution of Environmental Emergency, so watch for it. Next up is John Burrows. John is coming to us by way of video. He's currently visiting at McGill Law School in Montreal. John is the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. He's published widely, but in the area of constitutional law has been incredibly important in helping us to understand the Indigenous roots of Canadian constitutional law and the important Indigenous presence in the current development of our constitutional law. Next up is DJ, well actually I think David Suzuki might be speaking next, but I've started to introduce DJ Larkin to you, so I'll continue to do that. DJ Larkin is a staff lawyer at Pivot Legal Society. DJ practices in the area of housing law and advocacy, constitutional human rights, and prisoner rights. She's a staunch defender and advocate of social justice in our city, our region, and we're very lucky to have her with us tonight. And our last speaker is David Suzuki, and I didn't check with David what he wants me to say about him, but I'm going to say the following, and I hope it's okay. He's an internationally known environmentalist and scientist, co-founder of the David Suzuki Foundation, and frankly, a national treasure.
So I would like to bring Elder Larry Grant to the podium to properly welcome us.
Thank you for that. I'm Larry Grant. I'm a Musqueam elder, and I'm also an adjunct professor in the First Nations Endangered Language Program and a resident elder at the First Nations House of Learning at the University of British Columbia. And I would like to say a few words of welcome to all of you that are here this evening. My name is Ayetlak. I'm from the Musqueam First Nation, and it was our ancestor, our great-great-great-grandparent that had welcomed the first Spanish ship under Captain Narvaez and the first English ship under Captain George Vancouver. And as our ancestor did in the past, I also do this evening and raise my hands in welcome to all of you here at the Goldcorp Theatre on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people that we share along with our relatives from Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. I want to say thank you. There was no resistance to all the different spiritualities and different faiths in the world coming into this land, the land of our ancestors. So our people have lived on this delta for at least 10,000 years, since the last ice age, and our community has been occupied continuously by our people for the last 4,000 years in the Vancouver area. So again, I say that's a little bit of my perception, and probably many of our community members across Canada, that the Constitution is very lacking in many of those areas that I just spoke of. So again, on behalf of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, and as our ancestors had done in the past, I raise my hands in welcome to all of you here again at the Goldcorp Theatre at Simon Fraser University on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. Hai tsepka siem nasyeya kalet konsi tsiya tala taswalab hui namat hui ti tana hunet. Hai tsepka. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Grant, for that generous and beautiful welcoming. I would now like to introduce Jocelyn Stacey to talk about pipelines and constitutions.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Elder Grant and Margot. I'm going to speak about the Trans Mountain Pipeline and our Constitution this afternoon. So I'm assuming that most of you, perhaps all of you, are familiar with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Some of you perhaps were even kayaking today protesting the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But I'm going to talk about specifically the constitutional terrain that this pipeline crosses. To brush up your recollection on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the proposed pipeline expansion will triple the capacity of the existing pipeline to bring in crude oil from the Alberta oil sands to the Vancouver port. It will increase crude oil tanker traffic by seven-fold. And it's received federal and provincial authorizations, notwithstanding the fact that communities that will bear the brunt of the consequences of a major spill have and continue to vehemently protest this pipeline. So a pipeline is a conduit. It's a conduit for oil and gas. It's a conduit, as we now know, for political controversy. It's a conduit for inequality. It connects communities at one end of the pipeline that will benefit from its development to communities that will bear the burden of the risks associated with it. And my goal tonight is to persuade you that a pipeline can also be a conduit for understanding the implications of our Constitution and our constitutional structure for confronting the challenge of creating an ecologically sustainable future. So a bit of background. I know Margot did a little bit of this already, but a bit of background. Our Constitution divides up powers between the federal government and the provincial level of government. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline is an interprovincial pipeline. In constitutional language, it's called a federal undertaking, and that's an enterprise that connects two provinces with each other. And so in fact, most of you, I'm guessing, don't know this. The Trans Mountain Pipeline has been to the Supreme Court of Canada before on constitutional issues, where in 1954, the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed that the Trans Mountain Pipeline is a federal undertaking and thus a matter of exclusive federal jurisdiction. And in that case, the Supreme Court of Canada held that the particular provincial law at issue did not apply to Trans Mountain. Okay, so otherwise valid provincial law did not apply to Trans Mountain. Now, the overwhelming tide in Canadian constitutional law emphasizes cooperation between levels of government, except when it comes to these federal undertakings. Courts continue to determine that valid provincial law cannot be applicable to a federal undertaking when it would impair an essential part of that enterprise. So the upshot is that the provincial legislature is constitutionally limited in its ability to regulate the pipeline. And that means that any provincial law or municipal law, for that matter, cannot impair a vital or essential part of the pipeline. So the question that I have for you tonight is why, when a pipeline is a conduit for climate change, a conduit for the unequal distribution of benefits and risks, the constitutional principles of exclusivity apply and not the constitutional principles of cooperation. And so my hope is when the courts are asked to revisit the Trans Mountain Pipeline again on these constitutional matters, that this pipeline might just be what breaks down this last stronghold of federal exclusivity. And it's precisely because a pipeline is a conduit, right? It's necessarily connected to a bigger conversation about ecological sustainability and environmental justice. My hope is that we're recognizing that there's a much greater need for cooperation between federal and provincial and Indigenous governments to ensure that vulnerable communities are prepared for climate-related disasters. So the uniqueness of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, I hope, is that it's a conduit. It's a conduit for us to understand, for us to understand in a tangible way some of these more technical details of constitutional law and their implications for BC in being able to regulate or to regulate with respect to the pipeline and defend BC's interests against the expansion of this pipeline.
I'd like to introduce DJ Larkin from the Pivot Legal Society.
So I wrote a lot of notes this week, and then I decided I didn't want to follow any of them. I woke up this morning warm and dry and beside an unfortunately smelly dog, but I woke up safe, and I got up and I had a cup of coffee. And I don't want to presume what anyone in this room's morning looked like, but I'm going to venture to guess that most of you also woke up warm and dry and safe and got up and decided what you wanted to do with your day. And I assure you, that is not the case for a single person I work with. So I'm going to ask you for a second to put down your phones and to take a breath and to imagine something with me. Imagine as you sit here, someone takes your bag and your jacket and your phone and your wallet and everything you have. You have no coat, you have no clothes, you have no keys, you have no phone, you have no wallet, no ID, no nothing, no cash. Your friends and your family will not answer the phone when you call. The Starbucks will not let you sit there. You have no way to get into your home, no way to get into your car. You have nothing left. I want you to ask yourself, what would I do tonight? And if you think you have an answer, then I want you to ask yourself, what would I do tomorrow when I am wet and cold and I still have nothing? Because that is the legacy of our Constitution at 150 years and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms at 35 years when it comes to social justice issues and the right to housing. It has led us to a point where every single day you open the news and you see a headline about how unaffordable housing is. You see a headline about homelessness. You see a headline about Airbnb. These processes of gentrification, urban renewal, commodification of short-term housing has led to a space where we feel pushed out. I feel pushed out. We feel fear. And it is this legacy that almost 5 years ago led me to a homeless camp where I sat with a man who explained to me how the police cut open his tent, how they pepper sprayed his neighbor's tent, how they cut down the tent of a man with a disability in the middle of winter and later admitted they didn't know where he was going to go and they didn't care. That is the legacy that is creating uncertainty and fear in our society. Does it mean that we have to open up the Constitution and rewrite the language? A complex question indeed, and one that we cannot address in 8 minutes. Do we try to get the government to incorporate economic, social, and cultural rights into our laws and policies by incorporating the Covenant on Economics and Social and Cultural Rights into our laws? Both may be possible, both are massive endeavors, and both require political will. And even if we did that, we might feel so satisfied because maybe the word housing would exist within our Constitution. But that would only be a beginning unto itself, because the words of our laws are not justice. They are a beginning. We are 35 years into the Charter, and we're just starting to understand gender equality under the Charter. And so even if we did that, it would be a beginning. Well, it may be a political decision to say what housing gets put where. It cannot be a political decision to simply deny people the very basics of existence. That is where our Constitution has to set a minimum standard, and that is what we can demand of our courts. And my second reason for hope is you. And if today you leave and you have learned nothing and nothing was new to you, then I ask you, why are you silent? Or what more can you do? And I will close by saying, I promise to do this, and I ask you to do it with me. As you drive home, bus, walk, bike home, as you turn the key to your door, as you slip into bed tonight, I want you to think back. And I want you to ask yourself, what would my life quickly turn into if all of this was taken away? And I want you to take a moment of gratitude, and then I want you to promise to act. Whether it is to say yes to shelter and housing in your community, yes to inclusion of people who are marginalized, whether it is to demand of your politicians, what are they doing, or to support an individual in your community. I truly believe that daily activism changes who we are as a society, and that is how our Constitution evolves.
Okay, I think we have John Burrows.
So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity that I've been given to be able to speak with you. And the context is that about 60% of kids in care in British Columbia are Indigenous children. And on the prairie provinces, 80 to 90% of people in provincial prisons are Indigenous. And when we look at the rates of employment and educational completion, we find much lower participation. In fact, I've been in some communities in northern British Columbia recently where less than 10% of the kids are graduating from grade 8, and so they're not even going on to high school. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada has created a fiction that says Aboriginal rights cannot be recognized or grow unless they are connected with things that they were doing prior to the arrival of Europeans. In a case called Vanderpeet, the court held that therefore Aboriginal rights are frozen in time in being able to find further development after that date. Fortunately, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says that Indigenous peoples should be treated as peoples. And that would help to, I think, overcome this bias that we can only claim rights if they were integral to our culture prior to the arrival of Europeans. If rights exist as peoples, there should be no need for an historic test. Article 1 of UNDRIP, as this declaration is called, says that Indigenous peoples have the right to the full enjoyment as collectives and as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and international human rights law. So it's important to critique what's happened in our Constitution by reference to this other document. Article 4 of UNDRIP says that Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters related to their internal and local affairs. Article 5 says that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully in political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. These are significant articles because they indicate that Indigenous peoples have rights that exist by way of law without having to prove that these were things that they were doing prior to the arrival of Europeans. Now, fortunately, the Government of Canada has promised to implement UNDRIP. By adopting and implementing the Declaration, we are excited that we are breathing life into Section 35 and recognizing as a full box of rights for Indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, this is an important promise. As the Supreme Court of Canada wrote in a case called Badger, that the honor of the Crown is always at stake in dealing with Indian people. Now, there are things that Indigenous peoples can do themselves to help implement the Declaration. They, through their own constitutional and legislative actions, can take matters into their own hands by implementing the Declaration in their own communities. As you may know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was developed by the broad participation of Indigenous peoples across the world through many decades. And it would be passing ironic if Indigenous peoples were expecting the state to implement the Declaration and they themselves did not pick up those obligations in their own terms. Article 18 of the Declaration says that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making processes. But think of this list as being, again, protective not only of Indigenous peoples against the Canadian state, but also something that would help to facilitate the revitalization of Indigenous law in their own context. So here's the list that Indigenous peoples have the rights to: religion, spiritual beliefs and practices, speech and expression, association, life, liberty and security, property, family togetherness, a right not to be discriminated against by their governments, the privileges and immunities of citizenship, language, education, labor fairness, administrative law provisions of notice, fairness, and hearing, healthcare, and gender equality. While it's important to recognize that these laws were enumerated to apply as against states, there is no good reason for restricting their reach as it relates to self-determination in Indigenous communities as they're trying to recognize and affirm their own place in the world. So my points are basically twofold, that the Constitution that only allows rights to be recognized if they are integral to distinctive culture prior to the arrival of Europeans is a racist and a colonial and a statement that is inconsistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And through picking up the rights of peoples and following the promises that were pledged by the Crown and holding the Crown to diligent fulfillment of those promises provides an opportunity to put peoples fully at the center of our constitutional document. And as peoples are at the center of this document, then we can see the revitalization of Indigenous peoples' own laws start to take care of some of these issues of healthcare and over-incarceration and education and employment in ways that put us in a partnership or nation-to-nation relationship with the state rather than being marginalized and discriminated against and finding ourselves at the lowest rungs of society.
Our next speaker is a longtime hero of mine and needs no introduction, but David Suzuki. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Joel. I feel a bit of a fraud. I didn't realize it. It's going to be all about the Constitution, about which I know absolutely nothing. So, and as I was telling Mark, I wrote a talk out, and then as I was coming on the bus here, I wrote another one. And then as I heard the various speakers, I threw both of them out, and I've been frantically trying to figure out what the hell am I going to say. This area, of course, was occupied by flourishing cultures of people, but this was also home to cougars, bears, moose, wolves. You could go out in English Bay and certain times of the year catch abundant herring, oolakins, halibut, salmon. It was a very different world here, and of course the planet only had to sustain just over 1.5 billion people. So we've got, in 150 years, five times the population of the planet. People who occupied Vancouver 150 years ago lived rich lives that had been sustained for thousands of years. And in fact, around the world, the Indigenous people are the only people with a track record of any kind of ability to live sustainably. We talk about sustainable development now and how we've got to work toward it. We don't have a clue how the hell to live sustainably. For one thing, the planet is a radically different place than it has been for a long time. As an environmentalist, the best expression of that anthropocentrism was the last 9.5 years of Stephen Harper's regime, in which he argued over and over again, we can't do anything about the environment, about climate change, it'll destroy the economy. And so in that statement, he elevated the economy above the very atmosphere that gives us life, that gives us weather and climate. And this is the challenge we face. I had spent 8 years studying at the university level in the United States. And I came back to Canada, a hotshot geneticist, and I was going to make my mark. And a woman came along and completely sidetracked me. And it's been the story of my life, my adult life, usually disastrous. But in this case, I'm ever grateful to Rachel Carson, who published a book called Silent Spring. And Silent Spring, as a scientist, as I read that, I realized that, you know, here this activity I was involved in, science, which I loved and was so dedicated to, was fundamentally defective or flawed in that we were very good at focusing on a part of nature. But what Rachel Carson showed us is, again, a reminder of what Indigenous people around the world know. everything is connected to everything else. And what you do here on a farmer's field ultimately resonates or ripples throughout your surroundings, and you end up spraying on farmer's field to kill pests, and you end up affecting fish and birds and human beings. So that, that book also said, look, you're very smart, but we don't know enough to anticipate the long-term consequences of a powerful technology like pesticides. I've spent more and more time concerned about. And, you know, when her book came out, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. The word environment just didn't mean what it has come to mean today. But in the years after her book came out, I mean, we began to set up departments of the environment. We had laws protecting air, water, endangered species. Millions of hectares of land began to be set aside to be protected as wilderness areas. And I was a part of a big movement, and we celebrated many victories. 4 years ago, I got a call from the CEO of one of the largest oil companies in the Alberta tar sands, and he said, would you be willing to talk to me? I said, of course. I'm not fighting. We can't have winners and losers. We've all got to be winners. Yes, come down. And the next morning, he showed up at my office, and I was effusive in my welcoming him and thanking him and all that stuff. And I said, before we go into my office, I want you to do me one favor. I want you to leave your identity as the CEO of an oil company outside the door. I want to meet you as one human being with another. Because quite frankly, I don't see the point about talking about the tar sands or anything else until we both are completely solid on what we both agree on the things that matter most to us. I could see by his body language, this is not what he came down for. But to his credit, he reluctantly came into my office. And I said, look, thank you for coming. I know this is not what you expected. So let me tell you what I'm thinking. I said, we live in a world in which laws of nature shape and constrain the world that we live in. And we can't do anything about those laws of nature. We have to live within them. Physics tells us we can't build a rocket that will travel faster than the speed of light. Well, we say, well, but humans are smart. We don't live within specific ecosystems or habitats. It's true. But we still live within the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. That's our home. And there is a maximum number that can be sustained indefinitely on the planet. And that's dictated by the carrying capacity of the biosphere. And of course, that number is predicated or dictated not just by the numbers of humans there are, but the amount that we consume per person. And every scientist tells me, even if we all lived at a level of consumption as Somalians or Bangladeshis, we're still overpopulated. That is, our numbers cannot be sustained indefinitely. And people say, well, what do you mean the population's still growing? If we're past that number, how can we even have 7.5 billion people? Well, the answer is we do that by creating the illusion that everything's fine by using up the rightful legacy of our children and grandchildren. I was invited to give a talk to the first annual conference of green builders in the United States in Austin, Texas. 3,000 people, a lot of children, and I said, now kids, if you remember one thing from my lecture, remember we're animals. My God, this woman came down, she was so pissed off, she said, don't call my daughter an animal, we're human beings. I said, madam, I'm really sorry, if your daughter isn't an animal, is she a plant? Because we're either an animal or a plant. And I said, Mr. CEO, as an animal, what is our most important, our most necessary need? And instead of giving you an answer the way any child would, he went, and I could see he's thinking, job, money. I said, look, if you don't have a breath of air for 3 minutes, you're dead. If you have to breathe contaminated air, you're sick. So would you agree with me? Air should be sacred. Air should be the thing that we have to protect above anything else because we can't exist without it or be healthy without it. And then I said, you and I, we're 60 to 70% water by weight. We're basically a big blob of water with enough thickener added so we don't dribble away on the floor. But we leak water out of our skin and our eyes and our nose and our crotch, and we lose water. And so I said, Mr. CEO, if you don't have water for 4 to 6 days, you're dead. If you have to drink contaminated water, you're sick. So can we put water up there as sacred and something that has to be protected above all else? And with food, it's a bit different, but every bit of our food was once alive. Most of it grew in the soil. And if you don't have food for 4 to 6 weeks, you die. Polluted food, you sicken. So can we put soil and food up there along with clean water and clean air? And finally, every bit of the energy that we burn in our fuels, oil, gas, coal, dung, wood, peat, and every bit of the energy in our bodies that we need to move and work and grow and reproduce, all of that is sunlight. Sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis, converted into molecules that can store that energy, and then we get it by eating plants or animals that eat the plants, and we store it in our bodies. And when we need to move or work, we burn those molecules, oxidizing them to release the energy of the sun back into our bodies. So photosynthesis should be up there with clean soil and food and clean water and clean air. And then finally I said, Mr. CEO, the miracle to me of life on Earth is those 4 elements that indigenous people around the world call earth, air, fire, and water. This is why when I go to Alberta to speak, I say, I don't give a damn what you do with your tar sands. Dig it up, burn it, whatever. As long as what you do stays within the boundaries of Alberta, go ahead and do it. Of course, that's impossible. He's a good human being. I said, if you shake hands with me and agree with me what I've just said to you about the foundations of the way we live, I will do everything I can to help you and your company. And what do you think he did? He couldn't. If he were to go back to his shareholders and say, well, I had a discussion with Suzuki, and, you know, I agree with him. Whatever we do, we can't mess with the air, the water, the soil. He'd get fired in a picosecond because that's not his job. And this is the challenge. We've elevated politics and economics above the very things that keep us alive. And here may I end by saying the only people that understand that today are the, environmentalists, I hope, but the indigenous people are deeply embedded in that worldview, and they have so much to teach us. I find it ironic that after all that's been done to the original peoples of these lands over the last 150 years, they're still here and they've got something we desperately need.
I want to begin by thanking all of our panelists for wonderful, engaging, and really important presentations. 2 of the questions talk about the content of the Canadian Constitution. And David, I know it's sort of unfair. I've put you in the middle of a bunch of constitutional law types, but I think you're up to it. Someone said, if you had a magic wand, what would you change or add or remove from the Constitution? And does it make a difference if we have text that says explicitly things like protecting the environment or the right to adequate housing in the Constitution, for example? DJ, you're closest to me, so would you?
No pressure.
Hi. I think it is easy to say, you know, it's easier said than done, that incorporating language of social and economic and cultural rights, including the right to an adequate standard of living, which encompasses much more than the right to housing, would certainly be a way forward, but it's not the only way forward. And I thought it was really fascinating what you said about how our laws are completely anthropocentric. I think we need to fundamentally grapple with that. Otherwise, the incorporation of social and economic rights still doesn't get us where we need to be.
My foundation has been working to try to get enshrined the right to a healthy environment in the Constitution. And now the next step is to enshrine the rights of nature.
The understanding that we have to have of constitutions is that they are verbs. And as a verb, they're things that we act upon and act through. And sometimes we get enamored with the idea that constitutions are for courts to interpret or for parliaments to interpret, when in fact it's people like us that are the main interpreters and actors in relationship to these constitutions. And then to take David's point, it is the fact that we are in a relationship, or we are pre-constituted by the air, the water, the rocks, the fire, the soil. And I can remember just going many places across this country, when Indigenous peoples talk to me about constitutionalism, they talk to me about how we are in relationship, we are constituted with these broader life forces, and that as we think about being then actors in a constitutional drama, we have ways that can respect and honor and facilitate and enhance the forces of life that are around us, as we pick up some of these Indigenous traditions that David's talking about, and the revitalization of Indigenous law within a Canadian constitutional framework would see these relationships, these ideas of the Constitution is the land, that's the boss, and that we can then get in a better relationship with it as a way to working through some of our challenges.
There's been a lot of work, as I'm sure many people know, about trying to get recognition for social, cultural, and economic rights recognized through Section 7 of the Charter. So Section 7 of the Charter protects our life, liberty, and security of the person is not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And so there's space there in the words of life, liberty, and security of the person to try to embed some recognition of social, cultural, and economic rights in there. And there have been a lot of attempts to recognize some form of environmental protection in that as well. But in fact, when you look at the court cases and the tribunal cases where people have been trying to recognize a right to a healthy environment in Section 7, by far the number of cases brought are people that are challenging wind turbine development. So I think we have to be careful, right, that the words there, right, it's kind of baffling, right? By far the number of cases brought seeking environment sort of related justice under Section 7 is with respect to wind turbine development. So the words are not alone, cannot sort of stand on their own, right? They need an understanding of constitutionalism that recognizes social, cultural, economic rights behind that to really give that meaning.
Yeah, there's been so many attempts through various lenses to get at these social and economic issues from a constitutional perspective. And there's been a lot of disappointment, frankly. And a lot of that turns on what I was talking about how our charter is really good at saying, don't tread on me. It's not really good at saying, give us the basis upon which we can fully participate or giving those positive rights. And so we have hit some roadblocks for sure. What I can say, though, is that the Supreme Court of Canada has left the door open. To an extent. They have said, you know, it's possible. We haven't gotten there yet.
I mean, in each of the areas you work, what's the relationship between social movements in the streets, organizing, mobilizing? We've been talking about constitutional politics and this somewhat rarefied atmosphere of litigation, of courts, of rights, but do you think the chances of succeeding with these kinds of arguments is going to be based on mass mobilizations of people challenging the kinds of fundamental market structures and assumptions that we've all been talking about?
There was a question up on Twitter, like, can the Constitution get us to where we want to? And I am going to say, like, I would not presume that the law is actually going to get us to where we need to be. I think that is a construct, and it is a tool. I think the Constitution and the law can do two things. It can enshrine in a place that we have deemed important that which we have already as a society decided we want, and it's usually pretty late on that, or it can occasionally push us or nudge us in a direction that we have maybe not had the bravery to go in. but it is in solidarity with political movements and in solidarity with the people who are doing the work on the ground and the people with direct experience that any meaning is derived.
Yes, I think that social movements do have a role. When we look at what happened with Idle No More, we saw that there was a lot that added to the conversations when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was released and then UNDRIP was adopted. But I also think we need to be careful when we think about social movements and their possibilities for success. Indigenous peoples did not want, by and large, the Constitution to be patriated. They wanted to see their relationship being with a power across the ocean as a nation-to-nation relationship rather than being domesticated within Canada. And, people got in the streets about that. They traveled across the country in trains to try to resist the domestication and the constitutionalization of Aboriginal and treaty rights, and it didn't work. And then I also think about all these blockades and occupations that take place across the country, and we often see those, and they're varied in their success. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they just end up in a 30, 35-year milieu. But there's also a social movement that is very broad, that has dispossessed Indigenous peoples from their land. British Columbia was basically settled by people blockading, by squatting on land, by taking up land through direct action. And so if we think that social action and direct action is the panacea, we just have to look around us and see where it's gotten us. So I celebrate and look to the possibilities of social action, but at the same time, I'm deeply skeptical and pessimistic about social action too, when I consider how our country has been formed through social action that has dispossessed Indigenous peoples.
And another comment is that we've known about the threat of global warming for a long time. But in the 1970s, I became aware that this was an environmental issue to look at. But I wrote an article saying global warming is what we called it back then, is a real danger to our survival. But it's a long-term, a slow-motion catastrophe. I never had any idea it would kick in as quickly as it has. So if you look at the evidence and then our response to it, you realize the enormous power of money. Because if you look at the denials, the deniers, or the skeptics of climate change, that is driven by enormous funding from the fossil fuel industry and by billionaires in the United States. And it's worked. We've done nothing.
Final words on this question. So to build on what others said, I think, I think there's a lot of agreement that constitutions ultimately lie with the people, and I think David's right that what we're facing now requires a different kind of constitutional literacy, a different kind of literacy about the world, right, in the sort of information era that we live in now. And I guess the challenge is to understand how social movements fit into that. Do social movements enable people to become more literate in terms of politics more generally, or do they entrench positions?
Can I say how impressed I am with steps that are beginning to be taken around the world to regard rivers and mountains as life forces? In New Zealand, with the Wanganui River, there's a recognition that it's its own person. And the Ganges in India, through the common law, similar recognitions. To the extent that we regard the life forces around us as having this kind of agency, and not just these artificial bodies like corporations that you've written about so strongly, Joel, I think we'll be in a better place. And so I would think that there's a lot to be learned as we look at the Maori and understand what they were doing to try to recognize rivers as life forces in accordance with their law.
And so my wish and my hope is that we kind of talk about, we talk about constitutional watertight containers. Well, we also have to talk about that in terms of our social movements and our societal movements, and we have to have these conversations with each other. Like John was saying, he has this skepticism around how social movements can make change because of how we have used those things against each other in the past. And I have hope that the more we have this dialogue about how social justice and environmental justice should never be at odds to each other, and they have been sometimes in the past, and we need to move past that and move forward in solidarity. And so I feel compelled to have those conversations, and I hope that we will.
Yeah, nicely said. I also see these as complementary, and a lot of the challenges that I see in terms of environmental law moving forward, I think operate in parallel to the challenge of reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people and broader challenges of social justice as well. And I guess to echo John's point, I think we should look for these moments where things have gone right, look for these moments of hope, whether it's the recognition of legal personality and ecosystems, as in New Zealand, whether it's, as slow as it's happening, that we might, want to push for quicker change, that we are now finally moving towards mitigating climate change at a national scale in Canada, and to keep that kind of pressure on.
You can't talk about sustainability in the long run if we don't have social justice. And so, we've got to all work together. We're in the same boat. As a biologist, I'm interested in our evolutionary roots. And as you know, all the trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. And when you think of us appearing as this funny-looking, two-legged, furless ape, that was us in a world where the abundance and diversity of life was so much great, many times more than you'd see on the Serengeti today. You got to say, I'll bet you no other species went to their kids and said, shh, don't piss him off. They're going to take over the planet. I mean, you look at us, we weren't impressive. There weren't many, we weren't big, we weren't fast or strong, we didn't have special senses. But we had this thing in here. The brain was our key. And one of the things it did is it invented an idea called the future. I mean, the future doesn't exist. It's just a concept. What we know exists is now and what we remember from the past. But because we invented the idea of a future, it meant that we recognized what we do today can affect the future. That we can look ahead and see where there are opportunities and see where there are dangers. And we can choose deliberately today to try to avoid danger and exploit opportunity. Foresight, I believe, was the great advantage we had that got us to where we are. And now we have all the amplified predictive capacity of scientists and supercomputers. And for over 40 years, we now have been denying that, and politics and economics overrides the very survival strategy of our species. And that's the tragedy of our time. The terrifying thing is that the window of opportunity to actually avoid catastrophic temperature rise, if there is still a window, is very, very thin, narrow. And there's no evidence that we're going to accelerate like we celebrated, thank God Harper was gone. We celebrated Trudeau, he did the great thing, went to Paris, not only signed the Paris Agreement, but said we got to aspire to a 1.5 degree rather than 2 degree target. And yet, he approved 3 pipelines. He's wants expanding the tar sand. Like, what the hell? He's still using Harper's target. So,
Well,
I'm sorry to end on that note.
Well, so Joel thinks what the hell's a great thing to end on. I actually was all ready before you said your last little bit, David, to say we really accomplished what we had hoped for with this event, which is to bring together and to get some traction across all 3 of the concerns of environmentalism, social justice, and Indigenous justice. And I thought we were going to end on that point, but we certainly we certainly lodged on that point for some time. And I think the urgency that your last comments bring to the conversation, David, are also important things to end on. And I want to say thanks, David. You've done really well talking about the Constitution or not talking about the Constitution. And yep. And I want to thank all of our audience for coming and participating, for the tweets that went out. Again, thank you to the Peter Wall Institute and to the Royal Society of Canada. Thanks to Joel, but particularly thank you to David, Jocelyn, DJ, and John from afar. Thank you for your patience with the technology. Thank you all so much.